Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us as we kick off 3 days of Imperial Lates events exploring the brain. My name is James, and I'll be your host tonight as we start at the beginning, taking a whistle-stop tour through 3,500 years of science as humanity has battled to comprehend what I guess remains still to this day the most complex object in the known universe. It's a journey that starts in ancient Egypt and takes in ancient Greece, Rome, the Enlightenment, before we eventually arrive in the modern world of neuroscience with all its cutting-edge imaging techniques. To help us in this journey, we're joined by Imperial neuroscientist and science historian Dr. Stefano Sandrone, as well as being a senior teaching fellow and a principal investigator within Imperial's computational, cognitive, and clinical neuroimaging laboratory, carrying out all sorts of studies in neuroimaging, neuroplasticity, and we'll explore those terms later on. Stefano has also published numerous books on the history of neurology and of neuroscience, and won many awards in neuroscience and education. Stefano, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, James. Good evening, everyone.
Right. Before we get started, and we've got a lot of time to get through, I'd like to remind everyone watching at home that this is an interactive event, so please do send in your questions and thoughts on the YouTube chat. I've got my colleague Mimi, she's working away in the background. She'll be monitoring the chat, responding to your questions, and also, most importantly, sending them on to me to put to Stefano later in the evening. Could I please ask everyone out there to be considerate when you are posting in the chat? We want to create a really nice, warm, welcoming space for this online conversation. And we will be removing anyone that disrupts the experience for others. So, if that's all understood, everyone's ready, let's settle in. My first question, Stefano, we've called this event 3,500 Years of Brain Science, but can you sort of briefly explain what we're actually talking about when we say brain science? Maybe even what we're talking about, the more scientific term neuroscience. What do these terms actually mean?
Neuroscience is one of the most exciting frontiers in science. Technically, the term neuroscience was coined only in the 60s, so not too long ago, actually, by a Professor Francis Schmidt, biophysicist working at the MIT. With the term neuroscience, we intend the study of the brain and of the spinal cord, which together compose the central nervous system, but then also of the peripheral nervous system, namely all the nerves or ganglia outside the central nervous system.
Perfect. And your job here at Imperial is on a day-to-day basis, teaching, carrying out research in neuroscience, and we'll come on to all of that later. But I just wondered how you got interested in the history of science in this area. Not every academic goes back millennia to chart the origins of their subject. Where did that sort of passion come from?
That's a great question, actually. I've always been fascinated by history. I remember when I was a kid reading books about the ancient Egypt or about the ancient Greece. I mean, that was my cup of tea. Or given that I am Italian, probably I should say my cup of coffee. So in many ways, I've always tried to embrace this historical perspective while studying since I was a high school student.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, yeah, it certainly paid off in terms of some of the books you've written, and I guess the story we're going to hear tonight. So let's start on that voyage of discovery. Let's go back 3,500 years. We're going back to ancient Egypt, where back then we find the first reference to the brain ever written down in written text. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Indeed. In many ways, this can be considered the starting point, and the oldest occurrence of the word brain actually was found in the so-called Edwin Smith papyrus. Now, imagine that this is brain written in hieroglyphics. It's a pretty large papyrus, about 5 meters. So you can see in this slide the comparison with a London double-decker. And differently to many other pieces not survived to nowadays, unfortunately, in this one, for the first time, there are many references to medical treatments or clinical cases about the brain. The papyrus had been found and then bought in the 1862, but only translated in 1930. So think about the delay between when it was bought and then the time of translation. Many of the cases are traumatic brain injuries, overall 48 cases, And still, this is the first piece of evidence with neurological clinical cases with almost no reference to magic elements. I'm saying almost because on the one side, there are 48 clinical cases, but on the other side, still 8 magic spells. Now, according to many historians, the magic spells were really the last possibility. Like when no other treatment worked, then they tried their best. And also probably they did their magic.
So they were reluctant to ascribe magic as the cause or the treatment, but in some instances they had no other answer, I guess.
Indeed, and they were trying to find some anyway in the magic word.
So I don't want to speak for our entire audience, but I think a lot of people in school will have learned that and been kind of excited by or sort of maybe by the idea of mummification in ancient Egypt. And one thing that stuck in my brain, ironically, I guess, is the idea that the ancient Egyptians removed the brain through the nose. I wondered, and then I think discarded it. I don't know if does that suggest they didn't value it or see it as particularly important? What can we take from that particular practice?
That's a great point, James, because in many ways the question we have, and also they had millennia ago, was what was the key function of the brain? According to them, it was to produce mucus. So, according to the ancient Egyptians, it was the heart and not the brain, the most important organ of the body. And that's exactly why, as you said, they were able to remove the brain during mummification through the nose. In many ways, it was the heart and not the brain, the center of the vital activity.
Well, so we're gonna come on to this next. This sort of what is quite an age-old battle, I guess, between the heart and the mind as to what's the sort of most important organ in the body. What's the center of our self? And in that battle, our brain received a boost during the sort of the Roman era. So we're coming forward a bit in time due to a man called Galen. Can you tell us a bit about him and how impactful some of his ideas were?
Yes, indeed. So we move from Egypt to Greece, 1,000 years closer to where we are today. And the big question at that time for thinkers, philosophers, physicians, surgeons was, where is the seat of the soul? And indeed, there was a battle, a metaphorical one, between the brain and the heart. Now, think about the way we use today to say that we have learned something. We say we have learned something by art. In many ways, this is a legacy in the English we speak every day about where the seat of the soul was believed to be. But then at a certain point, someone came to the scene. And that someone was, as you mentioned, Galen of Pergamon. And for the first time, probably, someone else might have said it before, but Galen has been really epitomized as the person who said that. Said the brain is the center of the mental life. Now, your question was about the impact that Galen had. And he wrote more than 500 treatises, but only about 30% are still nowadays with us. So, as with Leonardo da Vinci, we don't have the full production, but only 1/3, probably even less than that. He had a huge impact on anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, neurology, of course, pathology, so the clinical sides of the things, and also on philosophy, because nowadays we see topics as compartmentalized areas, but actually many millennia ago, it was only one body of knowledge, one corpus. Now, let me tell you something about Galen. He was able to do many experiments on animals. And that was, at the same time, what made him truly special, on the one side, but also what misled, for probably another 900 years, fellow scientists. So there were two problems with that. Number one, he was dissecting monkeys and pigs' brains, thinking the same points were absolutely valid for the human brains. That was not the case, as we know nowadays. But also the second problem was his ideas were kept for granted for 1,000 years. Why was this the case? Very simple. His teaching were ex cathedra, so nobody was really so bold to challenge ideas. And that was a problem, indeed.
So he's a weighty figure. He's a lofty figure that people were reluctant to be seen to sort of undermine him in any way, or even I guess you have to have a lot of confidence or conviction of your ideas to challenge the great Galen. The idea that lasted that for 1,000 years, that sort of that enigma that he had, that's incredible, really.
It is, yes, it is absolutely incredible, and also, as you said, it was a turning point. Good and bad ways at the same time.
We had a question come in from Jeremy, who asked, what inspired Galen to think differently from everyone?
That's a great question, by the way, because the common approach at that time was to use a pretty much a speculative approach, and just like trying to understand how the body works, and in this case, how the brain was working by reading ancient text. So Galen, in many ways, did something very simple, but very bold. He started to do some experiment with the animals and try to speculate with a sort of experimental approach. That was a turning point.
Yeah, I mean, using animals as a models or simplified models or models for sort of understanding human mechanical systems. I mean, that's still a very modern way of doing science. So yeah, I guess it's historical roots maybe started, or at least in part started with this man. We also had a question that I think it was more related to our time in ancient Egypt from Espace Esprit, who asked, was that description of the brain and the sort of the ideas of applying treatments or prescriptions, was that carried out by shamans in that particular role? What sort of people in ancient Egyptian society would have been looking at potential sort of treatments and things like that?
That's another great question. I mean, I like having the audience so engaged. Well, actually, we don't know too many things about the papyrus. So we don't know who wrote it, for example. Probably it was written by someone from that part of the society that was responsible to cure people. Now, we don't know if they were physicians, if they were probably people connected to religion, or if they were really knowledgeable people / philosopher. But what I can say is that clearly the reference to traumatic brain injury is not surprising, in the sense that at that time that was a big problem, especially when there were battles or when something happened at that time. The head was injured. What happened to the brain? So great question. We don't know exactly who the authors of the papyrus were.
No, absolutely. Greg, thank you. Yeah, and as Espace and Jeremy have done, please do send in your questions throughout. If is anything you hear from Stefano tonight triggers a question or a thought, please do post it in the chat, and we'll try and we'll interrupt our conversation to try and address them at various points. Right, so back to our journey through time towards the present day. The next character in this story enters from the 16th century Flanders area. His name is Andrea Vesalius. He seems a character that from a Quentin Tarantino movie in some ways. Can you explain that sort of characterization?
Yes, I think that Quentin Tarantino could make a movie about Andreas Vesalius. Now, one step back, imagine being at this specific point in time. If you were to walk inside an anatomical theater at that time, you would have seen these scenes. So red arrow, a body to be dissected. And then you see 3 yellow arrows, right? One of the 3, they are all from the academic stuff, or what we would call nowadays as academic stuff. One is a lecturer, so one is reading anatomical text from Galen and fellow scientists. Then the second person is indicating the different components that are being dissected. And the third person is actually dissecting the body. So there were 3 people doing 3 different things. And when this Andreas Vesalius, the potential main character for a movie by Quentin Tarantino, was studying, he was noticing that there was a gap. There was really a mismatch between what the reader was reading, what the lecturer was reading, and then what he was actually seeing with his own eyes. And now with our own eyes, we see Andreas Vesalius. He was born in 1514. He spent his very early years in Brussels, not too far from the place where those sentenced to death were executed. And that's the first Tarantinian reference. He was the son and the grandson of the cool physician, and then he also had quite strange hobbies, because he was wandering in these fields where the executed people were. He was wandering through the bodies, and sometimes he took a knife and started to dissect them to see how the body and the brain were made. Understandably, he studied medicine, not because of the Tarantinian touch, but because he was truly interested in knowing more how the body and the brain work. So he studied in Leuven, in Paris, and in Padua at the time, and still at this time, in many ways, leading centers. But the great point is, since being a student, he was a teacher, which is an oxymoron to say. Since the very beginning, he was an early career professor, not just a student.
Great. So, we've seen a picture there of one of these dissection sessions. I love the sort of terraces. It reminds you of like old-fashioned football stadiums where you've got the posts that people lean on, but like encircling this sort of live dissection. I wonder if you can give us a sort of how it might have felt, a flavour of how it might have felt to attend one of these dissections. I don't know if you want to talk from your own perspective, how exciting it would be for someone like yourself to have attended, or a general member of the public of the time.
Great point. Let's imagine to be there. So this will be what we will see the moment where we open the door. Many people around the body to be dissected. But now let's go further into details. So the yellow arrow now is signaling Andreas Vesalius. So if we were lucky enough, we will be able to see Andreas Vesalius at work. Then on the left side, you can see somebody naked, and probably, this is a very much fictional aspect, but probably it could be considered the next in line to be dissected on that dissection table. At the center, we see a skeleton, which clearly was the destiny that was attending all the people in that room. On the left side, we also see a monkey. Please follow the arrow so you can see all the details. On the right side, we can see a dog, and both the monkey and the dog were reference to the old ways of doing things. So not dissecting humans, but animals. And then see other people around the table. So you can see people from different parts of the society. And you can spot the different shoes they wear or they do not wear. Now, let me tell you that these snapshots that you're just saying was one of the covers of the De Humani Corporis Fabrica, which was the most important series of books written by Andreas Vesalius, collecting all his experiments and all his findings about the brain. Last, but certainly not least, you can see the level of details within these pictures. So this was a sort of a marketing from the Renaissance. If you want to come and learn from my dissection, buy the book, and this is what you will discover. I found it really colorful on the one side, but a bit splatter on the other one.
Amazing. So it's clearly, his events were like these real big draws, or they seem like very prestigious events that people would go to, and he's maybe a bit of a showman up on stage. I wondered, from a sort of medicine perspective, what were some of his sort of significant achievements?
Yes, he was, as you said, a showman in many ways. And now we even don't know where the boundary between the reality and the fictional world starts with this cover, because we all know that at the time, education was not something for everybody. And probably still nowadays, education needs to be even more inclusive in many ways. But the big point about it is Andreas Vesalius, when he was very young, age 28, wrote the most important book in the history of medicine. I mean, this is a fantastic achievement, right? You can see the cover on the left. And if we want to translate the title from Latin, I would say we can use something like the human body, or the workings of the human body, or how the human body work. It was more on the anatomical side than physiology, but understandably that was a fantastic achievement. And in 3 months, he got his PhD. I mean, I did my PhD in the UK, and more or less the average time is 3 years. And the following day, he became a professor of anatomy. So really, it is a phenomenal accomplishment. But at the same time, we have to say that this was also one of the most expensive books ever. He was very smart in the sense that he decided to collaborate with the famous artistician at this workshop, and they realized the figures. Now, it was a beautiful book to read, it was fantastic to see the figures as well, but there was a problem. It was very expensive. And the students, and we know that 500 years ago, but also nowadays, do not have a big budget to spend on books. So very wisely, to prevent expensive copies from being pirated, Vesalius also prepared a smaller version for the students, the Epitome, which certainly was more consulted. You can see some of the pictures of the brain. So finally, in the Renaissance, we got to see the brain. And obviously, all these brains belonged to someone that was executed to death. Look at this. We can see the gyri, we can see the sulci. You see all these little waves on the surface of the brain. And again, to understand what they were and what they were for, we still need to wait probably 250 years. But still, look at these pictures. So accurate. I mean, these drawings were done 500 years ago, and still they are fascinating. A little less fascinating to discuss, but again, what I wanted to emphasize is that the book was not just about the brain, but on the human body and all the aspects you can think of. It was published in 1564, which was in many ways a revolutionary year, because on the one side, we have the book by Andreas Vesalius, De Humani Corpus Fabrica, but on the same year, Nicolaus Copernicus wrote on the revolutions of the celestial spheres. Andreas Vesalius moved really for the final time the vision of scientists and physicians from cardiocentrism, art as the seat of activity, mental activity, to cerebrocentrism, the brain is the center. And in a very nice parallelism with what Vesalius did, Copernicus moved from the geocentrism to heliocentrism. And if you're interested in knowing more about that, I wrote a book some years ago with Professor Marco Catani, which is entitled Brain Renaissance, where we translated the chapters of the Fabrica dedicated to the brain from Latin to English, and we commented upon what happened from Vesalius to modern neuroscience.
We had a couple of comments from people, I guess, before the cardiocentric revolution that his work, Vesalius's work in sort of brought about, I guess. We had a couple of people mentioning practices that I guess reflect when the heart was more the focus. We had a comment from Espace saying French kings had their hearts removed and buried separately. I don't know if that's a token of how important they were. And Pete Glass wrote, Richard Lionheart, King of England and Angevin, France, 1119, his heart embalmed and buried in Rouen Cathedral, and the rest of his body in Fontevraud Abbey, apart from entrails that went to Chalice. Oh, he's really, really carved up and separated out across various different places. But yeah, maybe that's reflective of before this revolution in thought, a revolution in perspective, I guess, about who we are really and what makes us who we are. The heart played a much more central role.
And think about also the symbolic aspect associated to it. I mean, today's talk is understandably only on medicine, but think about the philosophical takes. Think about the literature, about the art, about love, about life, about science. So all this also has a symbolic spin, which clearly we're not dealing with today, but again, Think about that. And yes, for many years, it was brain versus the heart.
Yeah, apart from the only bits that are left over is the kind of the more emotive elements of human. Like Valentine's Day cards don't have brains on them. We think with our heart when it comes to sort of certain aspects of human behavior. But yeah, I think that's the only bits that the heart gets nowadays. Really, it doesn't really get the rest of it. So we're going to move forward again, another sort of 400 or 500 years, I guess. So we're going into the 20th century now, and we're going to see neuroscience starting to get some recognition with its first Nobel Prize in 1906. And this was a collaboration between two scientists, or two scientists were sort of awarded the prize. However, rather than a meeting of the minds, the two awardees, we had one from Italy and one from Spain, and they had actually very different ideas for how the brain was made up. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that debate between them.
Oh, yes, with pleasure. So from Vesalius to the 1880s, from Flanders to Italy and Spain, here on the left we have Camillo Golgi from Pavia, not too far from Milan. He invented the so-called Golgi staining, also known as black reaction. So trying really to simplify as much as possible, the picture you see on the right is a little section from a brain cut, and probably a mice, I think. Or you can do easily the same with the human brain. And you see different structures, the neurons. You see they have a body, which are these black dots. This is exactly how the human cortex is organized. And then you see these arms, right? The axons. So the problem was, when he saw this picture with his own microscope and his own staining, he thought that was a network of neurons. And he started to champion the reticular theory. So that's on the right side is a human slice of the brain. But with the same technique, someone else in Spain, Santiago Ramon y Cajal from Navarra, said, no, this is a set of neurons. It's not a network. It's not a reticular theory, but it is an ensemble of many neurons. And he started to champion the neuron doctrine. Then the Nobel Prize for Medicine in 1906 was jointly awarded to Camillo Golgi and Santiago Ramon y Cajal for their studies on the neuron. However, they didn't really interact too much in Stockholm during the ceremony. And actually, over the years, they had several debates about, is it a reticular theory or was it like just a series of neurons? We have to say, from the eyes from 2022, from our perspective, that Camillo Golgi invented a revolutionary method, but the interpretation, well, that was really right on the Cajal side. And again, in many ways, this story epitomizes that science is also about competition, but collaboration, because many scientists nowadays can work with the Golgi technique and Cajal interpretation. Now, I don't want to say that Cajal was completely right, because recent papers really shown that there were some aspects of the theory that were not completely true, but still, he made many experiments. And what we know today about the brain is thanks to the collaboration between many years of histories, between scientists using Golgi technique and putting new theoretical and experimental takes to it. A great story, right?
Yeah, what fascinating to a pair of people to both be awarded that prize, but have it's nice in a sense that I guess one of them got the credit in the long term for the theory and one for the sort of interpretation. It's nice it was handed out that way, but yeah, it shows that it's not there are competing ideas, there are competing thoughts, and I guess scientific progress benefits from those competing ideas and thoughts, I guess, as people strive to try and prove one or both of them true or false, I guess.
And that's a powerful message also for nowadays science. I mean, during the Renaissance, there was this idea of the lonely scientist, someone that all of a sudden, or after many years of studies, got to a point where, okay, they had the eureka moment. Well, let's be very pragmatic. Science nowadays is about collaboration, okay? It's about sharing data, it's about sharing tools. So that's the sort of science that we want to champion, not something in complete isolation.
See, speaking of isolation, I guess, or certainly people who might have been held back or locked out of contributing into this area of science in a certain way, you would have noticed that a lot of the people if not everyone that we've mentioned so far has been a man. But by the 20th century, the world of neuroscience is starting to realize that listening to some of the women scientists might actually be quite beneficial, and that shift is in part down to some of the barriers overcome by someone called Rita Montalcini. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about her story and why she is such an inspiration.
Yes, another great question. I am a big fan of recognizing the contribution of wonderful women in neuroscience and more generally in science, because this is true. This is what needs to be done. And in many ways, Rita Montalcini is a science hero for many people in Italy and around the world. And to introduce her properly, we need to move from 1906 Nobel Prize to the one awarded 80 years after it, 1986. On the right side of the screen, you see a picture of Rita Montalcini, and on the left of Stanley Cohen. So they jointly were awarded the Nobel Prize for their discoveries of growth factors. Now, very simply, growth factors are important elements in the growing process of cells. But let's start from Rita Montalcini. She was born in Turin, in the north side of Italy, on the 22nd of April, 1909. In her family, her mom, Adele Montalcini, painter, and the father was Adamo Levi, electrical engineer and mathematician. Rita, you can see her on the center of the screen, also had a twin sister named Paola. But in the same family, there were also Gino, here on the left, 7 years older than Rita, and Anna, called Nina, 9 years older than Rita. Now, in every family, there are many decisions to make, understandably. But the problem with the Rita Montalcini's family, and especially his father, was that he was, in many ways, the only person making decisions for everybody. And that was a problem, clearly. And despite his great respect for women, he strongly believed that a professional career interfered with the female duty and destiny of becoming wife and mother. Really bad, really horrible. But then what happened? He decided to send Rita to the Scuola Superiore Femminile Margherita di Savoia. Now, the name might not be familiar to too many people, but the real point is that going to that kind of school would have prevented Rita from studying at the university a medical subject. Rita was not very enthusiastic, to say the least. She had poor performance in science and mathematics, although she was really showing a strong independent thinking. But all of that was useless for a potential academic career. At that time, Rita showed something that, with today's eyes, but also with at that time perspective, was extremely remarkable. She changed to a high school, filled her gaps in Greek, Latin, and mathematics in 8 months, and entered the medical school in Turin. So, what a wonderful story is that, James? What do you think?
Yeah, well, incredible. For barriers to be put up, and for people, and for someone not to quite understandably conform to them, or certainly sort of bend towards where society is kind of pushing you, but to sort of stand up and go against that tide and restart again and go to a new school and start again from that. Yeah, it's incredible. I admire anyone who can sort of stand up against the sort of preconceptions of what people expect them to do.
Absolutely. That would be incredible by today's standard. Think about the standard of the 1930s in Italy. Probably even unthinkable, right? Mm-hmm. And she challenged everything and everyone. And she finally entered the medical school in Turin, the city where she was born.
Okay. So are you going to take the story on from there in terms of what happened after school, and whether that what her ultimate contribution was to the field?
Yes, I will. And certainly the years that follow her entering the medical school in Turin has been revolutionary, which is an adjective we have often quite used during this talk. But this was not only for our scientific information, but also for the societal events that happened in those years. So now we're focusing on the 1930-1936 spell. On the left, you have the picture of the class of 1936. 0 women among academics. 0 women. 6 women out of 92 students overall, so a percentage of 6.52%. And you can see them highlighted here on the left side of your screen in yellow. And this was Rita Montalcini, who brilliantly completed her studies with a summa cum laude degree. But let me tell you something. She entered a 3-year specialization in neurology and psychiatry. And again, I like how today we talk about neuroscience, but again, neuroscience is an interdisciplinary and a multidisciplinary topic with elements from neurology, psychology, psychiatry, physiology, medicine, anatomy. This is neuroscience, and we need to have different people coming from different scientific background to study the brain. Anyway, let's come back to Rita Montalcini. On the one side, she was doing her own medical practice, but on the other side, she also wanted to add some basic research training. And she decided to study with a mentor within the Anatomy Institute, neurohistologist Giuseppe Levi. As many times happen in life, and certainly in science, it is about meeting the right people that will make you flourish, that will support you. And Giuseppe Levi has been a fantastic mentor. Imagine that. He was the mentor of 3 Nobel Prize winners, Rita, Renato Dubecco, and Salvador Luria, in 3 different environments, right? Medicine, neuroscience for Rita, virology for Renato Dubecco, and microbiology for Salvador Luria. But let's come back to Rita. 1939, a very dark year for the world. The fascist regime in Italy promulgated laws barring non-Aryan Italian citizens from professional careers. Now, this is the front page of probably the leading or one of the most important Italian newspaper, Corriere della Sera, 1939. Laws have been approved. Horrible years. Weeks before the German invaded Belgium, Rita Montalcini came back to Italy because she was there for some years to learn a technique. And inspired by Santiago Ramón y Cajal, we met him some slides before. He was the Spanish scientist from Navarra who had worked alone in a makeshift lab in faraway Valencia. Levi Montalcini installed a small research unit in Turin, in her bedroom, in Corso Re Umberto in Turin, with the help of her mentor, Giuseppe Levi. So imagine how resilient was she. I mean, she decided to build a small lab in her bedroom. But it's only part of the story. Because then what happened is that the bombing by the Anglo-American Air Forces became bigger and bigger. And she had to move to another home laboratory in a farmhouse in the east around Asti. Now, Asti is not too far away from Turin, and coincidentally is also the province from where I was born. So I was born in a city called Canelli, where my grandfather has been mayor for many years. And this is a picture of Canelli, so of the hills surrounding Asti. And not too far from here, Rita Montalcini had her second laboratory. But then the war intensified. In 1943, she avoided deportation by seeking and having refugee in Florence, where she gave medical assistance to war refugees with Giuseppe Levi. At that time, 1943, all of Rita's family was living under a false name. And there you can see a picture of a city bombarded and destroyed by the war. That was the Second World War. Unfortunately, these are really something we would like to avoid seeing also nowadays. She returned with her family to Turin and regained her academic position. But 2 years later, she joined Washington University in St. Louis on the invitation of Hamburger, who was studying what would have become growth factors for the brain. On the right side of the screen, you can see the Mole Antonelliana, which is probably the most famous building in the Turin landscape. The idea for Levi Montalcini was to stay in the States only for 6 months. Then what happened is that she spent 26 years in the USA with a 3-month leave every year in Italy. The rest is history. And again, I'm a big supporter of women in science and women in neuroscience. And this is one of the stories that you can find in another book that I finished writing some months ago. It will be published at the beginning of May. The title is The Birth of Modern Neuroscience in Turin. I edited with Lorenzo Russo, Dr. Lorenzo Russo. And again, you can see the Mole, this building I was telling about some slides ago. Under that Mole Antonelliana, the modern neuroscience was birthed. So that's a great place to visit if you want to come as tourist, but also we need to rediscover stories about neuroscience in Turin.
What an individual, what a story. I hope her story is sort of inspired a future generation of female neuroscientists within Italy. It'd be great if her story was more well known internationally, so other countries, girls and women in other countries can benefit from her sort of all the barriers she overcome and her sort of inspirational story as well.
Indeed. I mean, I think that representation in science and in life matters, and only by showing these wonderful examples of scientists we can inspire the next generations. I mean, not necessarily everybody we need to become a scientist, but a story like that, I mean, how powerful is it? How powerful is to know that she's been so resilient, and then despite all the odds, she made a career out of what she wanted, and she changed neuroscience. Fascinating.
Brilliant. So we're going to bring the story even more up to date now, and we're going to look at one of the other, I guess, major innovations towards the end of the last century and over the last sort of 30, 40 years has been the world of neuroimaging. And this is where it comes into your realm, Stefano, a little bit in terms of your day-to-day job. So I wondered if you can explain how today we're able to explore the active brain of people who are very much alive. I mean, we've talked about a lot of dissections of brains and of animals and humans. I assume most of those were hopefully they're all deceased. But now we're able to look into the brain of alive people and set them tasks and do all sorts of things and look at how the brain works. Can you tell us a little bit about how that's possible and what that allows us to understand about the brain?
Yes, very much alive. One step back, the brain is a very complex organ. I decided to put a detail from one of Van Gogh's masterpieces, because one of my favorite sentences about the brain is that there are more neurons in the brain than stars in the sky. So the brain is very complex, right? On the one side, historically, and also nowadays, it's not just about investigating the human brain, but also simpler organisms in parallel. But on the other side, we need these multidisciplinary efforts. So investigating a single specific aspect of the human brain. And with the so-called neuroimaging techniques, we are able to see the brain in action. How does it work? Well, this scientific explanation is super complex and complicated because it involves a combination of physics and mathematics. But in a very simple way, when someone is lying inside the scanner, we can see, thanks to a sort of engineeristic calculation, we can see a reconstruction of the brain, which is really a good approximation spatially and temporally if you combine this with other techniques. So overall, these techniques allow the in vivo visualization of the brain and also gave new impetus to medicine, neurology, psychiatry, psychology, philosophy, and so on. Probably you might be more familiar when I name them: CT scan, computerized tomography; MRI, magnetic resonance imaging; fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging; or PET, position emission tomography. Now, Imperial College London has been at the forefront worldwide with many of these techniques and still is. Having said that, all of them have a different technique. Probably what I can say today is that magnetic resonance imaging allows us to see something structurally, the anatomy, whereas the functional magnetic resonance imaging is a good way to see not only the anatomy of the brain, but also which areas in the brain are active. Understandably, these open up new ways. So CT scan. Remember the brains drawn by Titian and this fellow artist for Vesalius' book. Now look at this. Many similarities, but in this case, the person is very much alive, as you said, James. fMRI, functional magnetic resonant imaging. So now this is a picture of the brain from above. Can you see the eyes on the top side of the screen? So these are 6 virtual slices of the brain. And when you see the red spots, it means that that area of the brain is active. So you can put the subject inside the scanner, you can ask them to perform a task, and those areas will light up. Again, I'm simplifying the language, okay? It's not lighting up, it's a series of complex mathematical calculation, but there you go. It is red, orange, yellow. Another technological advancements is the one allowing us to see white matter imaging. So the brain is not just about the neurons, but also about the connection between the neurons. So the white matter, the myelin around them, wrapping the axons. Another beautiful picture of the anatomy from a different perspective. Now, I could spend literally hours talking about the applications, okay? But to give you just a little bit of a flavor of what we can do with neuroimaging techniques, think about neurodiversity, like really visualizing the brain, understanding from them, trying to see how the brain is, for example, affected by dementia or by psychiatric conditions. Or maybe in the future, and it happened already in the past, how a neuroimaging evidence-based proof can be used in the courtroom to say that someone is guilty or not guilty. Or also in neuroeconomics and neuromarketing. So those disciplines where they try to see what happens in the brain when someone sees a particular marketing advertisement, or when you have to make a big decision, what happens in the brain, or the emotional side of the brain, or, and this is very relevant to the medical context, can we see the brain of someone and spotting already future sign of a potential disease? This is called biomarker, and this is another very exciting aspect. Or if you want to be on the artistic side of things, I love the field of neuroaesthetics, which is, for example, trying to discover what happens in the brain when you look at the masterpiece. Probably you've heard about the mirror neurons, right? Mirror neurons. Yes, when we see a painting, for example, quite often the mirror neurons get activated as if we were embodying what we were about to see. And last, but certainly not least, think about neuroethics. So there are scientists in the world nowadays trying to see if the boundaries of ethics can be retrieved and found within the brains, where they are and how cultural norms can be linked to brain and behaviors. Really, many aspects to be discovered and studied, maybe even by people in the audience, who knows?
Brilliant. Okay, so our journey, well, this is one journey we've taken here where we've gone, well, we spanned millennia in our journey up to sort of somewhere approaching the present day. At the Imperial Lates event on Wednesday, a lot of those techniques that Stefano's mentioned, we'll have teams telling you about some of the results that they're getting from using some of those techniques. We had a couple more questions for tonight, though. There was a question I had around other traditions of science that have explored the brain, and it actually links to something, or maybe one example is something, a question that Robert Clayton has suggested. He asked about whether we had access to Chinese documents on brain research. So I didn't know whether China's great sort of cultural history provide is another story that could be looked at, or another story that could be told, or if there are other traditions, scientific traditions, Stefano, that have explored or tried to answer some of these questions about the brain.
That's a very relevant point. So clearly, in today's event, which was a little less than 60 minutes, we could only see some of the milestones in the history of neuroscience. But understandably, there are many narratives that need to be updated. So we still do not have too many information about certain areas of the world and what happened, for example, many millennia ago. I think about the Arabic tradition. I think about the Asian history of neuroscience. I think about all the contribution from other continents. Think about Africa, South America. So confidentially, I'm very interested in all these cultures. I have done also some work with people and collaborators, for example, from South America, trying to establish a new comprehensive narrative. So the answer is yes, there are absolutely many stories and histories of science to be told. And this is probably an invitation for the people in the audience and for the next generations of neuroscientists. Please do not only stop at what has been discovered so far, because it is true that with neuroimaging techniques and with many experiments in the lab, we can make new discoveries, but we can also make new discoveries in the history of neuroscience, and they're not less important than other achievements that we can accomplish. So we need to study and to learn from history, and we need to update the narratives.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. We had a question on about the relationship between neuroscience and psychiatry. I wondered if are those two disciplines coming together as we understand more about the brain, or are they? Are there any overlaps at all? How do those two disciplines interact in the modern world of science?
From my perspective, and this is due to both my personal upbringing but also my scientific upbringing, I really see no boundaries. I mean, to me, it is very difficult to compartmentalize things and say, okay, this is neuroscience, this is genetics, this is psychiatry. I mean, we have neuropsychiatry, we have neurogenetics, we have the neuroscience, psychology. So I think that this all part of needing to have a label, to put on something, is probably due to a sort of specialization. But again, to me, the brain is one. It is really myriads of different facets. We need to study them all. But again, we need to collaborate with psychiatrists, neurologists, psychologists, because with such a complex object in front of us, it is only by collaborating with other people with different scientific background that we can find answers about how the brain works. So yes, there are overlapping between neurology and psychiatry. And also I am studying some of the links actually between the two disciplines. And it is only by collaborating that we can find answers.
Great, thank you. In terms of, we've heard about your some of the areas academically that you're and research-wise you're interested in, and this sort of passion and interest in the history of the subject. I wonder how your research into the history of neuroscience, how does it impact your approach to your day-to-day science, or how you think about your day-to-day science? I wondered, do you see yourself as part of a lineage, and is that helpful in any way?
Yes, I mean, it is super helpful, and actually I would like to see more people doing it. It is helpful in many ways. I mean, it is inspirational. I am inspired when I come across stories like the one by Rita Montalcini. Well, not by, of Rita Montalcini. Number one, inspiration. Number two, it is very useful because sometimes we tend to ignore what has been done before us, but it is very important before starting new research to see what has been done before. And maybe there are some, texts from 100 years ago that are still informative towards what we do today. And then number three, because I think we have the duty to make it right, or at least to try to give the reflection of what really happened. So try to put new narratives, try to put new life also to history. And we need to learn from history. That's my point number 4, to avoid repeating the same mistakes, but also to see how only by collaboration we can achieve great results. So at least 4 big benefits of it.
Another question from Andrea, who says, is there perhaps a need for more focus on the neuroscience of living well rather than just the focus on disease?
That's another great point. I would say that, to me, they are really 2 aspects of the same study. So we need to understand the brain. We need to understand how disease works, for example, how they affect the brain. But over the last years, even more, there has been this impetus towards studying well-being. What are the neural correlates of well-being? There are also many research going on about the neuroscience of happiness, for example, like how we can make the best out of living a great life, happy and healthier. So yes, I think that year by year, we see a shift towards this as well. So we are trying now only to embrace the complexity of the brain. And by doing so, we will be better able not only to apply what we know to the disease, but also to promote a healthy well-being. 100%.
Can we optimize joy neurologically or through neuroscience? That would be an interesting perspective on it. Right. I have one more question that I wanted to finish off on. I know you mentioned the when you showed the Van Gogh picture, you talked about the complexity of the brain, or quantified it in a sense. Is there any other sort of particular fun or favorite facts about this about the brain that you want to share to finish off tonight's event?
I could keep continuing this for hours, but for the sake of time, numbers. a couple of them.
Yep.
We have 100 billion neurons in the brain. The brain is approximately 1.5 kilos. It is only 2% of the body weight, but it uses 20% of energy. It is made of water. 80% of the brain is water. I mean, how strange, how fascinating is it? And last but not least, there are no pain receptors. So basically, when there are many surgical activities, if someone puts like a little stick in the brain will not feel pain because there are no pain receptors. And then my last number, which is 3500. I hope you enjoyed this overview. It was really only, 3,500 years in 60 minutes, but I hope that was inspiring.
Well, yeah, brilliant. It certainly was inspirational for me. I hope the people watching at home agree and found it inspirational in their own way. Yeah, thank you so much, Stefano, for telling us that story and taking us on through time on an incredible journey. Unfortunately, that does bring us to the end of tonight, our journey through our evolving understanding of our highly evolved brains, I guess you could call it. Thanks so much, Stefano, for joining us. For those who were watching, apologize if we didn't get to any of your questions or read out your thoughts. As I mentioned, tonight is the start of 3 nights of events under the Imperial Lates banner, where we will be exploring the brain across various mediums, platforms. Tomorrow night, the Lates moves over to Instagram, and we have a live event where a mental health researcher, Dr. Lindsay Dewar, she's going to be discussing her research into the impact of social media and online connections on young people's mental health. So that should be really interesting. That conversation gets underway from 5 o'clock. And then on Wednesday, the Lates makes its long-awaited return to the real world as after a 2-year break, we take over our main entrance in South Kensington again. And we've got all sorts of brain scientists and neuroscientists doing live demos, workshops, giving talks, all of that sort of stuff. That's happening from 6 p.m. But yeah, other than that, hopefully you can join us either online Tuesday or in person on Wednesday. Otherwise, I think that's it from me. Thank you for everyone who tuned in. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much, Stefano. I think please join me in thanking everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone.